The content of this episode is for entertainment purposes only. Historical events and figures discussed are based on documented records, scholarly research, and primary sources. The Velvet Guillotine does not endorse any political, religious, or ideological interpretation of events portrayed. This episode contains discussions of institutional corruption, political violence, and the desecration of human remains. Listener discretion is advised. I want to open this one with a confession, because confession feels thematically appropriate here. There are episodes that I research and I think, man, this one's going to be really hard to tell. And then there are episodes that I research and I think, oh, darlings, I'm going to enjoy this one far more than is strictly appropriate for a woman of my supposed seriousness. And this episode, it's definitely going to be that second kind. So pour something dark, settle in, and let me walk you onto the most extraordinary crime scene that I have ever been invited to attend. And I want you to come at it the way that I do. Gloves on, lights up, and no flinching. We're going to examine the body. We're going to examine the people standing over the body. And we're going to ask the only question that has ever really mattered at a crime scene, which is not what happened. We already know what happened. The question is, who benefited? So picture a courtroom, January 897, Rome, the Basilica of St. John Lateran. And I need you to understand that this is not some drafty provincial chapel, not a parish on the wrong side of the Tiber. This is the Cathedral of Rome itself, the Pope's own church, the single most important room in the entire Christian world. And tonight, it is full. Bishops in their finery, priests, deacons, the cream of Roman nobility, perfumed, jeweled, and visibly wishing that they were anywhere else. The full institutional weight of Western religion. They are assembled, they are seated, and they are waiting. And in the front of the room, on a throne, in full papal regalia, the white cassock, the red mozzato, the jeweled tiara that sits just on the brow, well, there sits the defendant. Now, allow me to describe the defendant, because at my core, I am a woman who likes to read the autopsy report right out loud. The defendant is dead. Not recently dead, not jocorously laying in state, hands folded across your chest dead either. The defendant has been in the ground for the better part of a year. About 9 months, give or take. And that is through a Roman spring and a Roman summer. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. The Roman climate, my darlings, is not what you would call preservative. He was a pope named Formosus, and he died in his bed of being approximately 76 years old and very, very tired. In the April of 896, he was buried with every honor that his office afforded at the time. And tonight, he has been exhumed, arranged as best that the attendants could, buttoned into his vestments, and propped upright in a chair so that the living pope could scream at him. There is a deacon standing beside the body, and this poor man has been appointed to serve a defense counsel for a corpse, because even in 9th century Rome, there was at least the appearance requirement of due process. And at trial, technically, somebody needs to speak for the accused. And I want you to hold this young deacon in your mind for just a moment, because he has the worst single job in the room. His client cannot instruct him, cannot testify, cannot be cross-examined, and cannot, crucially, be acquitted. Because the verdict was decided before the shovel ever even broke the ground. And he is, in every sense, defending the indefensible. And his client is in no condition to thank him for it. Presiding, and I use that word very loosely, is Pope Stephen VI, and he does not delegate the questioning, for he cannot help himself. He paces, he circles the chair, and he leans into the ruined face of his predecessor and demands answers. He accuses the corpse of perjury, of coveting the throne that it sat on, of violating canon law, of betraying its sacred office. And the corpse, exercising its right to remain silent with truly admirable discipline, says nothing. Stephen just screams louder. The corpse is convicted on all counts, unanimously. And there is a grim comedy in the unanimity, as though anyone in that room was actually going to vote to acquit a man while the man who exhumed a pope and put him on trial watched from the front? No way. And then comes the sentence. The vestments are stripped from the body. The 3 fingers of the right hand, those are the blessing fingers. Those are the fingers that a bishop uses to ordain, to consecrate, and to perform the holy acts of the office. Well, they cut those fingers off of his hand. And the body? Well, what remained of it anyway? Well, they dragged it from the mother church of Christendom, hauled it through the streets of Rome, and threw it into the Tiber River. And I want to be very, very clear about something. This is not a metaphor. This is not a dream sequence. This is not a folk legend. This is not a lurid invention that I dressed up in some scholarly clothing. There is no asterisk. This is in the record. This happened. A sitting pope put his dead predecessor on trial, won, and threw the body into the river. Welcome to the Velvet Guillotine. I'm April Rain, and tonight we are conducting a postmortem on a postmortem on the Cadaver Synod of 897, which is, on its glittering absurd surface, one of the most spectacularly unhinged spectacles in all of history, and in all of history of organized religion at that. And which is, when you scratch the surface of this anyway, it's something much colder, and it's much more familiar. Because in its essence, it is a case study in what an institution does when there is no one on earth who has the power to tell it no. The church did not invent corruption, my darlings, but in the 9th century, it was definitely doing some original research. So let's go. To understand how a man ends up screaming at a corpse in the most sacred building in Europe, you have to understand what the papacy actually was in 897, because it was not the institution that you are picturing. Set aside those images that you have, the global spiritual empire, the serene old man in white on the balcony, the smooth machinery of cardinals and conclaves and incense and order. That is a public relations papacy. That is the brand. And the brand in 897 has very little to do with the operation. The smooth machinery of cardinals and conclaves and incense and order that I talked about, none of that exists yet. What the 9th century papacy actually was a street fight with vestments. So let me set the scene properly for you, because context is the entire case. The 9th century was the worst century to be alive in Western Europe, and the competition for that title is quite fierce. The Carolingian Empire, which is the great political structure that Charlemagne had stitched together, the one thing approaching order on the continent, had fallen apart after his death in 814. His grandsons spent the next several decades carving it up between them with all the familial warmth and restraint of people who are getting a will read to them and they hate each other. The Vikings were at their absolute height of their seasonal hobby of arriving by longboat and removing everything that wasn't nailed down. And quite a lot was not nailed down back then. The coasts of France, England, and Ireland were learning to dread the spring. And in 846, and I really want to tell you this one, Saracen raiders sailed up the Tiber and sacked the Basilica of St. Peter itself. They robbed the tomb of the apostle. And in the east, the Hungarian invaders, they were just starting to clear their throats. And Rome, eternal, holy, capital of the world Rome, was in practical terms a mid-sized Italian town that happened to be sitting on the most valuable symbolic real estate in all of Christendom. Lots of ruins, lots of relics, and a population that had cratered from its imperial heights. And almost no real power of its own. It was governed by an unstable, ever-shifting cocktail of the papacy. It was also governed by a handful of aggressive noble families, and whichever warlord happened to be strongest in the region in that particular season. And into that vacuum placed the most single coveted office in Europe. Because here is the thing about the papacy that makes it so dangerous. It was the one prize that conferred legitimacy over everyone else. Kings wanted the Pope to crown them. Bishops needed the Pope to appoint them. Every dispute over a throne, a marriage, an inheritance, a war, well, that eventually washed up at Rome looking for a blessing. And the man who held that office held the keys to everyone else's ambitions. And so naturally, everyone wanted to hold that man. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers tell the story way better than I can. Between 872 and 965, less than a single century, there were roughly 24 popes. 24. Some served years, some served months, and some served the number of weeks that you can count on one hand. They were elected, deposed, and exiled and imprisoned, and on more than one occasion, murdered. And they were frequently murdered by the factions backing the very next pope. The modern conclave, with all its sealed doors and its little chimney and its decorous little puffs of smoke, looks, very much by comparison, like a genteel book club that has just gotten slightly heated over the choices for this month. This was not a spiritual vocation in this era. Let's be honest with ourselves. It was a political appointment with excellent costumes and a body count. And the specific feud that gives us our episode tonight, well, it runs along the great fault line of the age. The fight between two power blocks for control over Italy and the imperial title. On one side, you have Lambert of Spoleto, the strongman of northern Italy, the local muscle. And on the other side, you have Arnulf of Carinthia, the German king pressing down from the north. Two factions, one prize, no referee. And our man Formosus, the body in the chair, well, he made the single decision that would define his life, end his peace, and then get him dug up. He picked a side, and then fatally, he switched. Hold on to the factions, Lambert and Arnulf. Remember that the men deciding Formosus was guilty all belonged to the team that Formosus had just walked out on. And we'll be coming back to that, because in this case, as in nearly every case, the verdict was just politics wearing a robe. So let me introduce you properly to the defendant, while he is still, at least for the purposes of this act, alive. Formosus was elected pope in 891, at roughly 70 years of age. He was, in the parlance of the day, a compromise candidate, which is the polite term for the man both factions can tolerate because he seems too old and too sensible to cause anyone any serious trouble. A delightful misjudgment, as it turns out. The elderly, my darlings, are often very underestimated. His career before the throne had been long, distinguished, and, this is the operative word here, complicated. He had been Bishop of Porto, which is a very serious post, and he had served as the papal legate to Bulgaria. That's the church's envoy to a kingdom that it was very keen to keep inside the fold. And he was apparently extraordinarily good at it. So good that the Bulgarians did something almost unheard of. They asked for him by name. They wanted Formosus specifically as their archbishop. They had met a great many churchmen, and they had decided that this was the one that they liked. Now, you would think that would be a feather in his cap, and in a healthy institution, it would have been. But in this one, it was a death sentence with a very long fuse. Because being wanted, being independently valuable, and being the man that the Bulgarians might prefer to Rome itself, well, that made Formosus a threat. And Pope John VIII looked at this popular, capable subordinate and saw not an asset, but a rival. He accused Formosus of conspiring against him, he excommunicated him, and he drove him into exile. Now, I want to pause on this because it is the very first appearance of the pattern that will run throughout this entire episode like a watermark. This institution's reflexive response to a capable man is not to promote him. It is to neutralize him. Competence reads as a danger. The instinct is always protect the people at the top from the people who might replace them. If you have ever worked inside a large corporation and watched a genuinely good person get quietly managed out for the crime of being good, well, then you already understand the 9th century papacy better than you would like to admit. In time, the excommunication was reversed. Formosus's priestly orders were restored. He came back from the cold, and being the elderly, sensible, too old to cause problem compromise candidate, he was eventually elected pope. And here is where I have to ask you to put your reading glasses on, because we have arrived at the canonical complication, and the canonical complication is the entire pretext for everything that's about to follow. So stay with me. It is dry, but it is also a loaded gun on the mantelpiece. The canon law of that period had very specific, very fussy rules about clerical orders. In particular, a man who had been ordained as bishop of one place and then returned to lay status and then came back, well, his standing could be challenged. There were strict readings under which Formosus's restored episcopal status was, shall we say, legally arguable. A technicality, a footnote, the sort of thing that should interest no one but a canon lawyer with insomnia. Except in a sacramental system, technicalities are radioactive. Because if Formosus had not validly been a bishop, then he had not validly been pope. And if he had not validly been pope, then every bishop that he had ordained had not really been a bishop. And every priest that those false bishops had ordained was not really a priest. And every baptism, every marriage, every last rite that those false priests had performed are all now invalid. The whole structure, all the way down, unspooling like a dropped reel of thread. The technicality was not a footnote. It was the fault line running under the entire church, and anyone who wanted to could jump up and down on it. And as Pope, Formosus made the choice that put a target on his exhumed back. Caught between Lambert of Spoleto and Arnulf of Carinthia, between the local strongman and the German king, he made a calculation. He invited Arnulf to come south, take Rome, and restore order. And Arnulf obliged. And in February of 896 in St. Peter's, Formosus placed the imperial crown on the German king's head and named him Holy Roman Emperor. You can imagine how the news landed with Lambert of Spoleto, the man who had expected to be emperor, watching the crown go to his rival, placed there by a pope who had once been on his side. Furious does not begin to cover it. Furious is just where it started. And then, 2 months after that coronation, Formosus did the one thing that should have ended the story. He died, peacefully, in his own bed, of natural causes, as far as anyone could tell. though given the climate of the times, the word natural was doing a certain amount of heavy lifting, and a few eyebrows did go up at the very timing of the thing. But he was buried, with all papal honors, in St. Peter's. And he was, at the moment at least, beyond reach, beyond politics, beyond revenge, and safe in the one place that no faction could follow. But you and I both know that that was not going to be allowed to stand. Enter Stephen VI. Stephen was a creature of the Lombard faction, the team Formosus had abandoned when he was handed the crown over to Arnulf. And Stephen's election to the papacy was not a spiritual event. It was actually a political installation. The Lombard network needed a pope who would do a specific job, and Stephen was the man holding the right grudge at the right moment. He understood with perfect clarity what he had been put there to accomplish. And what Stephen needed was not, in the end, revenge for his own sake. Revenge is a feeling. Stephen needed something colder and more useful. He needed a legal instrument. He needed to prove that Formosus had never validly been pope at all, because if Formosus's papacy could be declared null, then everything that flowed from it dissolved. The crowning of Arnulf, voided. Lombard's claim to the empire would be restored, and the bishops Formosus had ordained, including, crucially, men with their own power and their own loyalties, well, they could all be hauled in, told that their ordinations were worthless, and then forced to come crawling back for reordination on their knees, acknowledging the new regimen. It was not pettiness, darlings. It was a hostile takeover, and that body was just the paperwork. There was, however, one procedural inconvenience standing between Stephen and his clean legal victory, and that was that the defendant was dead. Most men would consider that an insurmountable obstacle, but Stephen just considered it a logistics problem. And here is the detail that I find genuinely revealing about the entire grotesque enterprise. It was not impulsive. It was not a man losing his temper and ordering something mad in the heat of the moment. It was planned. It was staged. It required exhuming a body, sourcing the vestments, arranging the throne, assembling the court, appointing the wretched deacon, summoning the bishops and the nobility. This was a production. Somebody even handled the catering. The Cadaver Synod was premeditated to its bones, and I do mean that literally. So, they opened the grave. Formosus had been dead 9 months. I told you that the Roman climate is unkind, and I was not being delicate. What was carried into the Basilica of St. John of Lateran and lowered into that throne was in precisely the condition 9 months in the ground produces, and no quality of fine white linen and red velvet was ever going to disguise that. They dressed the decay in costumes of the office. That image, with those holy vestments draped over what was no longer recognizably a man, is, I think, probably the single most honest picture of institutional power that has ever been accidentally staged. The robes were immaculate, and the thing inside them was very rotten. Make of that what you will, because I certainly have. And then the trial began. I have described it once to you already, but I want to walk through the room very slowly this time, because the details are the whole horror and the whole farce all at once. Stephen does not sit. He cannot. He prowls. He addresses the body directly, as though at any moment it might break and confess. He demands to know why Formosus perjured himself, why he broke an old oath to never return to Rome. And he demanded to know how Formosus dared scheme his way to the throne that he actually had no right to. He demands an accounting for ordinations Stephen had already decided were invalid, and he is not, by any account that reaches us, A composed man delivered measured charges. He is a man unraveling in public, in vestments, and in front of the assembled leadership of the Western Church. He's screaming questions at a corpse and growing angrier that it will not answer. And beside the throne, the deacon, speaking when permitted for the dead, offering whatever defense the theater will allow. And I think about that deacon more than I think about Stephen, because Stephen is the spectacle, but the deacon, he's the conscience. He's a small, terrified, powerless conscience, going through the legal motions because someone had to, knowing that the verdict was sealed, knowing his own safety depended on not defending too well. He is every person that has ever been handed an impossible assignment by a superior who has already decided the outcome and simply requires a witness to lend it the shape of fairness. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one. Guilty, on every count. The court of the most sacred institution in Europe found a 9-month-old corpse guilty of crimes against the church. And then the sentence was carried out on the body. The vestments stripped. The 3 fingers of the right hand that I told you about, the fingers of blessing, of consecration, the fingers that made the sacraments, severed. Some accounts say that the fingers actually went into the river separately, as if even the hand had to be tried in pieces. And the rest of him was dragged from the cathedral, through the public streets, and thrown into the Tiber, to be carried towards the sea like some kind of refuge. Well, that was the plan anyway. As you will see, the Tiber declined to cooperate. And so, actually for that matter, did all of Rome. Stephen had badly, catastrophically misread the audience. He had assumed, I think, that the public would receive the spectacle as it was intended, which was that it was a decisive demonstration of authority, a clear signal that the new regime had won and that the old one was not merely defeated, but erased, annihilated, stricken from the record so thoroughly that even the dead were not safe in it. But what the people of Rome saw was a man who had lost something, not a power struggle. Those they actually understood, and they had a front row seat to a new one practically every season. What they saw was a man who had lost his sense of proportion, his brakes, the thing that makes his authority recognizable as authority rather than as raw, naked appetite and ceremonial dress. And I want to dwell on this for just a minute, because there is a genuine and useful insight buried in that Roman reaction. And it is this: every community runs on unwritten laws. Lines that are never codified, never voted on, never posted on the door, but that everyone knows. And the function of those lines is to prevent the powerful from doing terrible things, because the powerful do terrible things constantly, and Rome knew it. The function of the lines is to keep the terrible things legible, contained, and within the boundaries of recognizable human conduct. The moment that someone in power crosses a line that fundamental in public where it cannot be unseen, well, the spell breaks. The robe stops reading as legitimacy and starts reading as simply a costume. And once a population sees the costume as a costume, well, the person wearing it, they're finished. Stephen had performed his cruelty in the most public way physically available to him, in the mother church of Christendom, in front of the assembled clergy and nobility. There was no spinning it, no quiet burial of the story, and no plausible deniability. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. And there are some things that once seen cannot be made to not have happened. And within months, Rome turned on him. There was a popular uprising, and Stephen VI was seized. And here's where the symbolism becomes almost too neat and too real, which is how you know it's history and not fiction, by the way. They stripped him of his vestments. The very thing that he'd done to Formosus was done right back to him. A deliberate, pointed echo. Authority unrobed. And then they threw him in a cell. And there, sometime in the summer of 897, Stephen VI was strangled to death. He had been pope for approximately 1 year. Now, you might think that that settles it, because the villain was punished, the dead man was avenged, and the natural order was restored so that you can roll that gentle outro music? But my friend, you would be assuming far too much faith in this institution. Because his predecessor, Pope Theodore II, only lasted 20 days. 20. But they were productive 20 days. You got to give the man his due. And in that window, Theodore convened a synod that declared the Cadaver Synod null and void. It formally rehabilitated Formosus and ordered his body, which had in the meantime been recovered from the river by a monk, the Tiber having gently returned its parcel to its shores. Well, they reinterred Formosus in St. Peter's with the full honors of the office. And then Theodore died after only 20 days. And in this period, I'm sure that you can understand, that nearly counts as a long and stable reign. Pope John IX then confirmed everything that Theodore had done. The acts of the Cadaver Synod were annulled, the written records of it were ordered burned, Formosus was a valid pope, his ordination stood, and the bishops he had consecrated were real bishops after all. The matter was, at long last, definitively, finally settled. At least for a little while. Because this is the 9th century papacy, and consistency was not among its gifts, let me tell you. Some years later, the political wheel turned again, and the old Lombard faction clawed its way back into relevance. A later pontificate actually convened yet another synod to reverse the rehabilitation and recondemn Formosus all over again. And the man who would eventually preside over that recondemnation, by the way, is a name worth filing away. Because you're going to meet him again very shortly. And he is somehow even worse. He is a charming gentleman named Sergius III. So let's do the ledger on poor old Formosus. He was elected, he reigned, he died, he was buried, he was exhumed, he was dressed, he was tried, he was convicted, he was mutilated, he was thrown in the river, he was fished out of the river, he was reburied, he was rehabilitated, he was recondemned, and he was, eventually, rehabilitated again. By which point one imagines even his supporters were exhausted. And the most powerful religious institution in the Western world spent years and an enormous quantity of political capital relitigating the legal status of a corpse. Convening councils, burning records, reversing reversals, all to determine whether a dead man had been allowed to do the job that he'd already finished doing and died before anyone complained about it. And I find that detail is more damning than the screaming, more damning than the river, more damning than even the severed fingers. The screaming was just one man's breakdown, but the years of relitigation were the institutions. And it was not Stephen who could not let the body rest. It was the system itself. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, surely this is the low point. A pope put a pope on trial and threw him in the river. Where exactly does one go from here? Well, my loves, we're just getting warm. Because the Cadaver Synod was not a freak event. It was not a single bad night in an otherwise dignified century. It was a symptom, an early, particularly photogenic symptom of a sustained institutional collapse that historians of the medieval church have given a name. And it is, I must say, the most candid name any scholarly establishment has ever assigned to anything. They call it pornocracy. The term was coined by a wonderfully venomous chronicler who never used a sharp word where a fatal one would do, and it refers to a period running roughly from 904 to 964, during which the papacy was effectively owned and operated by a single Roman noble family, the Theophlax, and in particular, their strong, formidable women. There was the matriarch Theodora and her daughters, Marozia and Theodora the Younger. These women decided who became pope, who stayed pope, and who very abruptly stopped being pope. Now, I have to be a responsible coroner for just a moment, because that name is a slander, and the slander itself is actually part of the story. Pornocracy, the role of harlots, is a sneer, and it obscures far more than it reveals. What was actually happening was perfectly ordinary medieval politics, with one detail that the chroniclers could not stomach, and that is that the operators at the center were women. Noble families controlled major institutions everywhere in this period. That was simply how power worked in this time. The Theophlactic women did exactly what noble families did. They managed alliances, brokered appointments, installed their people, except they did it in a world that gave women no formal channel for any of it, which means that they did it through informal channels. And they did it with a sophistication that, frankly, I admire even as I deplore the results. When men do this, history calls it statescraft. But when women do it, history reaches for a word like pornocracy and prints it for 1,000 years. I noticed that. I will always notice that. What the Theophlax were not doing, and let me be perfectly clear about this, was selecting popes for their theological depth. That criteria does not appear to have come up at all. So let me introduce a few of the gentlemen that they selected, because the brand voice demands it, and so, I confess, does my own enjoyment. First, there is Sergius III. Yes, that very man that I told you to remember. The one that would re-condemn poor Formosus all over again? That one. Well, Sergius came into power in 904, and he is credibly accused of having arranged the murder of 2 of his predecessors to clear his way to the throne. Which is one way to win an election, I guess, and certainly cuts down on the campaigning. But I digress. Sergius reportedly fathered a child with Marozia when she was approximately 15 years old. And that child was raised in the corridors of Roman power, surrounded by birth by the machinery of papal politics, and in the fullness of time, that child grew up to be Pope John IX. Let me repeat that again. In the fullness of time, that child grew up to become Pope John IX. The pornocracy did not merely select popes, it bred them. And then there is John XII, who is, and I want to be fair to a very crowded field here, the undisputed champion. John ascended the throne in 955 at a roughly 18 years of age. Because nothing says spiritual authority like a teenager, let me tell you. And he proceeded to conduct himself in a manner that scandalized even his contemporaries. Which, given his contemporaries, is a pretty staggering achievement. And in 963, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I convened a synod to deal with him. And the formal charges read against John XII in one of my favorite documents in all of history. And I'm going to read it to you, because I think you've earned it. He was charged with fornication, simony, which is the selling of church office and retail, ordaining a deacon in a church stable, which at least shows range, ordaining a 10-year-old boy as a bishop for money, blinding his own confessor, castrating and then murdering a cardinal, and toasting the devil out loud and by name at a gambling table. And lastly, but not leastly, turning the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, the holiest of holies, into a brothel. A brothel in the Pope's house. And I want to be clear that this is the very same Lateran complex where 60-odd years earlier, a corpse had been put on trial. This building had range. Shout out to the Dastardly Places episode I'm going to do this week, by the way. John XII died in 964 at the age of 27. The circumstances are contested, but the most enduring account holds that he suffered a very fatal stroke while in bed with a married woman. And a competing account adds the embellishment that the woman's husband arrived and assisted with the dying. But either way, he did not go gently, and he did not go alone. And now, I will be honest with you, the way that I always try to be honest with you, because the honesty is the whole point of this show. I am telling you all of this partly because it is genuinely, jaw-droppingly entertaining, and I would be lying if I pretended that it was otherwise. But toasting the devil at the card table is on a pure craft level magnificent villainy. But I am also telling you this for a reason, and that has nothing to do with entertainment. And that reason is this. These events are not rare exceptions. They are not carefully cherry-picked to shock you. These are documented, ordinary operating conditions of the most powerful religious institution in the Western world, sustained over a span of 60 years. This is not a bad apple, not one mad pope. This is a pattern. This is a system functioning exactly as its structure allowed it to function. Because the scandals are the system. The structure is the disease. And it is the structure that we are about to get on the table and open up, by the way. Because that, my darlings, is where the real autopsy is about to begin. So, let me set down the theatrical instruments for a few minutes and pick up the more clinical ones. Because underneath the corpse on the throne and the brothel in the palace and the devil being toasted at a gambling table, there is a structure. And the structure is the thing that actually matters. The thing that makes this episode something other than a collection of medieval horrors served up for your amusement. The 9th and 10th century papacy assembled a specific set of conditions. And I want to name them very precisely, one at a time. Because once you name them, you will start seeing them everywhere. And not only in the past either. The first condition is a monopoly on legitimacy. In the Christian world of this era, the papacy was the single ultimate source of spiritual authority. There was no second supplier. Kings needed papal sanction to rule legitimately. Bishops needed papal appointment to hold their sees. Every dispute that mattered over a crown, a marriage, a doctrine, an inheritance, well, eventually that was routed through Rome for a yes or a no. And the power to grant or withhold that yes was concentrated into a single human being. One person, one throne, one choke point through which the ambitions of an entire civilization had to pass. Concentrate that much power in a single point and remove any external check on it, and the behavior that we have spent this episode documenting is not an aberration. It is a predictable output, and it is what the machine is built to produce. The second condition is the gap between stated purpose and operational reality. On paper, in its own account of itself, the papacy existed to shepherd the spiritual life of Christendom. In practice, it operated as a political office embedded in a snake pit of competing dynasties, territorial wars, and factional knife fights. And it is in the gap between those two things, between what the institution says it is for and what it actually does all day, that every abuse in this episode found room to breathe. Because the stated purpose is not just a description, it's camouflage. The holiness of the office is what made the office worth seizing, and it is also what concealed the seizing. No one questions the man in the white robe too closely, precisely because of the robe. The sacred mission becomes the cover story for the profane operation. And the third condition is inadequate succession mechanics. There was no stable, self-governed, defensible process for selecting a new pope. The procedure was whatever the strongest faction in Rome could enforce at the moment that the chair came open. There was no firewall against force, and there was no firewall against money, which meant that the quality of the leadership depended entirely, and I mean entirely, on the quality of whoever happened to be in control of the city at the instant of each vacancy. You get a decent strongman, and you might get a decent pope. But if you get the Theophlax, then you get a teenager who toasts the devil. When the only thing standing between an institution and disaster is the personal character of whoever grabs the wheel, well, that institution is not governed. It's gambling. And the fourth condition. This is the one that I want you to carry out of this episode and into the rest of your life. That is that the fourth condition is self-referential accountability. When the church had a problem, the body that investigated the problem was the church. When Stephen VI wanted Formosus condemned, he convened a synod. And a synod is something that you've heard me say a couple of times in this episode. A synod is a church court staffed by church officials judging a church matter on behalf of the church. There was no external authority, no independent body with the standing to look at what the papacy was doing and say, with consequences behind it, no, this stops now. The institution audited itself, and I will give you free of charge the most reliable law that I know, the one that holds true across every century, every institution that I have ever examined on this table. Any institution that investigates itself will always, eventually, find itself innocent. Or, when partially convenient, find a corpse guilty. The verdict is never about the evidence. It is about who controls the court. 4 conditions: a monopoly on legitimacy, a gap between the slated purpose and the real one, a broken way of choosing leaders, and a system that answers only to itself. And here is the part that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, at least the way that it did mine at 2 o'clock in the morning when I had research papers scattered all around me. These 4 conditions are not medieval. They are not safely sealed behind the glass of a museum case and labeled. They are the structural preconditions of institutional rot in any era, in any organization of any kind. They appear in some combination in every great corruption story humanity has ever produced, and in a great many small ones that never make it into this podcast, by the way. But if you have ever worked inside a large corporation of any sort, you have felt at least one of these 4 breathing down the back of your neck. The specific form the breakdown took in 897, which was a pope shrieking at a 9-month-old corpse in a cathedral, well, that part is gloriously, irreducibly medieval. And we will not see its like ever again. But the machine that produced it, darlings, is still very much in service. It has only changed its costume. And that's because it always changes its costume. Now, I am not in the business of leaving you in the dark with no door, even on a show called The Velvet Guillotine. So let me tell you what eventually happened, because something did eventually happen. The patient did not, in the end, die on the table. The 10th and 11th centuries brought reform. Slow, contested, incomplete, and resisted at every step, but directionally real. The great engine of it was the Gregorian reform of the 11th century, named for the formidable Pope Gregory VII, and was in its essence the institution finally turning to face the rot that we have spent this entire hour cataloging. Gregory's program was clever because it went straight for 2 of our 4 conditions. It attacked simony, which is the buying and selling of church offices, and that simony had become so routine that it was practically a line item. It also attacked lay investitures. That's the practice of secular rulers appointing church officials. And lay investitures, if you have been paying attention, is precisely the mechanism that had turned the papacy into a factional prize in the first place. If kings and strong men get to appoint the bishops, then the church is just an extension of whoever currently holds the sword. But take that power away, and you only begin, to close the door against force. You start, for the first time, to repair the broken succession. And the fight over that one reform, well, it produced one of the greatest set pieces of medieval history. It's a scene so theatrical that I almost suspect it of being staged. Except that it's far too humiliating for anyone to have invented it on purpose. In 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, having been excommunicated by Gregory for refusing to give up his power to appoint bishops, traveled to the castle of Knossos in the depth of winter to beg forgiveness, and Gregory made him wait. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe stood outside the gate, barefoot, in the snow, in penance rags, for 3 days. 3 days before the Pope even deigned to let him in and grant absolution. It is one of the indelible images of institutional power. The emperor humbled in the snow before the Bishop of Rome. And I would love to tell you that that settled the matter, that virtue triumphed and that the bells rang and that everyone went home reformed. It did not, of course. This is the velvet guillotine. Henry took his absolution, returned to Germany, gathered his strength, and promptly resumed the entire conflict. Gregory, the great reformer, the man who made an emperor stand barefoot in the snow, well, he eventually died in exile. He was driven out of Rome by Henry's armies, and reportedly with bitter words of a man who had loved justice and was currently dying for it. The investiture controversy outlived both of them and was not formally resolved until the Concordat of Worms in 1122, by which time both of the men who had begun it were decades in their graves and well past caring. But here is what matters, and I want to give the reform its genuine due, because intellectual honesty cuts in both directions, and I am not interested in cheap cynicism. The direction had changed. The selection of popes slowly became more rule-governed. The College of Cardinals developed into a formal electoral body, an actual procedure with actual rules that could resist, at least somewhat, the application of raw force. Canon law was systemized, the pornocracy ended, the era of popes being routinely strangled in their cells by the next pope's faction faded into something that the church could look back on as an embarrassment rather than a regular Tuesday. It is not clean. It is not honest. The gap between the slated purpose and the operational reality, which is our second condition, that never truly closes in any institution anywhere ever. The gap is permanent. It is, I have come to believe, simply the price of having institutions at all. But the worst of the structural failures were, for a time at least, partially repaired. And the proof of the repair is almost poetic. The Cadaver Synod survives in memory as a famous exception. A thing so shocking that it gets its own name and its own episode. It is remembered as an outrage rather than merely one entry in a long, undistinguished list of comparable Tuesdays. And the fact that we can all call it exceptional at all is the only evidence that we have that something eventually got better. And now I want to end things where I began. And I want to do it with the lights down and the theatrics put away. Because I've had my fun tonight, darlings. Perhaps more fun than the subject strictly permits. And now, I owe someone a quieter moment. The institution is fascinating. The mechanism is genuinely illuminating. And I hope you carry the 4 conditions with you. The scandals are, I will not pretend otherwise, an extraordinary amount of fun. But underneath all of it, underneath the costumes and the camp and the structural analysis, there was a man. And the man whose body was used over every bit of this, he was a person. So let me give him the last word, or as close to it as he's ever going to get, since he was never permitted any of the others. Formosus was not a saint, and I am not going to sentimentalize him into one just to make a clean ending. because that would be its own kind of dishonesty. In all actuality, there are no clean endings here. He was a political operator inside a political institution, and he made choices that had real consequences for real people. The bishops he ordained, the king he crowned, the populations whose lives shifted when the power shifted. His canonical complications were real, whatever you think of how monstrously they were weaponized against his corpse. And what I want you to consider for one moment is the full ledger of what was done to him. He died at 76 years old in his bed of old age. That is about the gentlest exit available in this violent century. He was buried with honor, and then he was dug up, dressed, propped on a chair, screamed at, convicted, mutilated. Remember those fingers of his own blessing that they cut off of his hand? He was dragged through the streets. He was thrown in the river. He was recovered from that river by a monk, reburied, rehabilitated, recondemned, and then rehabilitated once more. He chose none of it. Not one moment of it after his death was his to refuse or accept. He could not answer a single charge. He could not correct the record. He could not point out the irony or protest the injustice or observe the grotesque theater of being made the instrument of one man's vendetta and then another's across years that he did not even live to see. And I will add across 12 full centuries into a recording booth in a world where he could not possibly ever even have imagined being narrated by a woman into a microphone for the entertainment of strangers, even now, even tonight, and even by me and you. And that, darlings, is the thing that I keep circling back to. The thing underneath the whole grim, glittering spectacle is the living use the dead. We always have. We use them to settle our scores, to win our arguments, to vindicate our positions, to delegitimize the people that we have decided to hate. The dead make such convenient instruments precisely because they cannot object. They cannot rise from the chair and say, "This is not who I was. That is not what I meant. That is your story that you're telling. It was never mine." Formosus' story stopped being his own a very, very long time ago. And I am uncomfortably aware that it is not certainly his own even now, even in this telling, and even in my respectful, careful, theatrical hands. I have used him too. The least that I can do is admit to it, because he deserved better. They usually do. This has been The Velvet Guillotine, and I'm April Rain. For further reading, John Julius Norwick's Absolute Monarchs, A History of Papacy, covers this whole lurid stretch with exactly the blend of rigor and relish that it demands. For the structure underneath the scandal, the pornocracy and the long road of the Gregorian reform, John Howe's work on medieval church reform is invaluable. And for the Cadaver Synod itself, set in its proper political context rather than served as a freak show, the relevant chapters of Thomas Noble's The Republic of St. Peter are where you should definitely go. The postscript this week takes a wider tour through papal dysfunction. The greatest hits, the full hall of shame, the institutional breakdown in its complete and staggering breadth. Because the Cadaver Synod, well, that deserves company. And my darlings, the company is absolutely extraordinary. So until next time, stay dark.